Welcome to Passions Illustrated. Before starting the video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. The clink of cutlery against fine china echoed through the elegant dining room of Le Bernardin, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants. The table, decorated with arrangements of white orchids and scented candles, celebrated 15 years of a marriage that night was about to collapse like a house of cards. Isabella Mitchell adjusted the navy blue dress that barely disguised her 6-month pregnancy. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the glass of sparkling water, watching its distorted reflection in the crystalline surface. Beside him, Richard Mitchell, heir to the Mitchell & Associates real estate empire, smiled nonchalantly at the guests, completely oblivious to the approaching storm. The Mitchell family occupied the high table. Margaret Mitchell, the 70-year-old matriarch, watched everything with her discerning eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. Robert Mitchell, the patriarch, maintained his characteristic aristocratic bearing, while Richard's sisters, Catherine and Victoria, chatted animatedly about their latest trips to Europe. Isabella took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her cell phone in her Chanel bag. The messages he had discovered 3 days ago still burned in his mind like a hot iron. It wasn't just a few messages exchanged with a random lover, it was years of systematic betrayal meetings in luxury hotels, empty promises of eternal love to other women. Here's to 15 years of the most admirable couple on the Upper East Side. Robert's voice echoed through the room, raising his glass of champagne. The 50 or so guests, all members of New York high society, raised their glasses in unison. Richard stood up, his Armani impeccably tailored, and extended his hand to Isabella. "My love, shall we make our speech?" It was at this moment that something inside Isabella definitively broke. 15 years of rehearsed smiles of pretending not, to see the lipstick stains on their shirts of believing excuses about late meetings and unexpected business trips. It all culminated in this instant of crystal clarity. "Yes, Richard, let's make our speech." Isabella rose gracefully, her voice surprisingly firm. The hall fell into an expectant silence. "Today is a special day." She began, her hand unconsciously resting on her belly. "A day of truth." Isabella took her cell phone out of her bag and with a few taps projected a sequence of compromising messages and photos onto the large screen in the room originally intended to show photos of the couple. Horror spread across Richard's face like paint spilled onto white canvas. Margaret Mitchell dropped her glass, the golden champagne forming a puddle at her feet. Catherine and Victoria exchanged stunned looks. "For 15 years, I built my life alongside a man I thought I knew." Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "But today, in front of everyone who witnessed our vows, I announce that this marriage is over." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard, pale as marble, tried to reach Isabella's hand. "Bella, my love, we can talk about this. I can explain." Don't touch me." Her voice cut through the air like a blade of ice. "And don't call me love. You lost that right a long time ago." Margaret Mitchell, surprising everyone, got up from her chair and walked over to Isabella. The Mitchell matriarch, known for her rigidity and attachment to appearances, held her daughter-in-law's hands. "My dear, you have my full support. Richard, I am deeply disappointed." The murmur of conversation began to grow throughout the room. Isabella stood upright, a protective hand on her belly, as Richard begged for a chance to explain. Robert Mitchell watched the scene with a mixture of anger and resignation, realizing that his son had destroyed not only his marriage but also the family's reputation. His true character was revealed in the shadows of the hotels he frequented, in the messages he exchanged, in the lies he told, said Isabella, addressing Richard for the last time. "This baby deserves to grow up knowing the true meaning of love and respect." As she walked towards the exit of the restaurant, Isabella felt an immense weight leave her shoulders. Years of doubts and insecurities dissolved into the certainty of his decision. Nighttime Manhattan greeted her with its bright lights and promises of a new beginning. In the ballroom, Richard stood still, watching his life fall apart. His mother Margaret approached him with a stern expression. "You had a true treasure, Richard, and you traded it for moments of empty pleasure. Now you will have to live with the consequences of your choices." His mother's words echoed in his mind as the guests began to discreetly leave. The Mitchell and Associates empire would survive the scandal, but Richard knew he had lost something far more valuable than money or social status. On the sidewalk at Le Bernardin, Isabella got into a taxi, leaving behind not only 15 years of marriage but also a version of herself that no longer existed. The driver asked where he should take her. "For the beginning," she replied, a small smile forming on her lips. "To my new beginning." The taxi plunged into Manhattan traffic, carrying Isabella toward an uncertain but genuinely her future. The city that never sleeps witnessed yet another story of rebirth as the lights of the skyscrapers shone like beacons guiding its path to freedom. Isabella woke up in the master suite at the Plaza Hotel, where she decided to temporarily stay after the dramatic night at Le Bernardin. Soft morning light filtered through the silk curtains, illuminating the papers spread out on the table, divorce documents that her lawyer James Rothschild had delivered the night before. His phone kept buzzing with messages of support and some desperate attempts from Richard to make contact. Margaret Mitchell had called 3 times since dawn, showing a genuine concern that Isabella had never imagined receiving from her mother-in-law. "Mrs. Mitchell." Isabella finally answered the 4th call, her voice still hoarse from sleep. "Please, darling, call me Margaret. I would like to have breakfast with you. There are important matters we need to discuss." An hour later, Isabella met Margaret at the elegant Palm Court restaurant, also on the plaza. The Mitchell matriarch was already seated at a discreet table, her Chanel blazer impeccable as always. "First of all," Margaret began, once Isabella had settled in, "I want you to know that I have instructed our lawyers to ensure that you and my grandson are properly supported. Richard may have destroyed your marriage, but I will not allow that to affect your future or that of the child." Isabella felt tears forming in her eyes. "Margaret, No, let me finish." Mrs. Mitchell adjusted her glasses. "I spent decades ignoring Robert's slip-ups, convincing myself that it was normal for men in positions of power. But yesterday, seeing you face Richard with such dignity, I realized all the years I've wasted trying to keep up appearances." The waiter served them both jasmine tea, and Margaret continued, "The mansion in Greenwich is yours. I've already arranged for it to be transferred into your name. It's a perfect place to raise a child away from the chaos of Manhattan and the gossip of society." "I can't accept," Isabella began, but was interrupted again. "You can and will accept it. Consider it repayment for all the years you brought genuine joy to our family, something I realize now my son did not deserve." As they talked across town, Richard was facing a tense meeting at the Mitchell and Associates office. Robert Mitchell was furious not so much about his son's infidelity, but about the public scandal that threatened the family business. 3 important contracts were canceled this morning," Robert snapped, throwing papers onto the mahogany desk. 15 years of building an unblemished reputation, and you ruin it all because you can't keep your pants on." Richard sank into his leather chair, looking as if he had aged a decade in a single night. "Dad, I don't want to hear your excuses." Robert stood up, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of Central Park. "As of today, you are removed from the presidency. Catherine will take your place temporarily." At the plaza, Isabella and Margaret were finishing their breakfast when Catherine Mitchell arrived, bringing with her a folder of documents. "The divorce papers are already being processed," Catherine informed them, sitting down with them. "And I got a preventative restraining order. Richard won't be able to approach you without prior authorization." Isabella felt a mix of relief and sadness. "I never imagined it would end like this." "None of us imagined," Catherine replied, holding her sister-in-law's hand. "But you showed us that there is strength in truth, even when it hurts." That afternoon, as Isabella was organizing her move to Greenwich, Richard appeared in the plaza lobby. visibly changed and carrying a bouquet of orchids, her favorite flowers. "Sir, you can't go up," the security guard informed him, blocking his path. "You don't understand. I need to talk to my wife," Richard insisted, his voice breaking, revealing that he had been drinking. "Ex-wife," corrected Catherine, who arrived at that moment. "Come on, Richard, you're making a fool of yourself." "Katie, please," he begged his sister. "I need to explain. I need to tell you that I can change." "To change?" Catherine laughed humorlessly. "Like the other 3 times you promised this, Isabella is pregnant, Richard. Pregnant. And yet you continued with your adventures as if your family meant nothing." The security guard gently led Richard out, leaving the orchids abandoned on the reception desk. Catherine went upstairs to find Isabella, who was watching the scene through the window of her suite. "He'll try again," Isabella commented, stroking her belly. "And each time you will find closed doors," Catherine assured. "Now, let's focus on what matters. Have you chosen the baby's room at the Greenwich house?" The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The mansion in Greenwich was completely renovated under the supervision of Margaret, who seemed determined to make up for her son's mistakes by transforming the property into a true paradise for Isabella and the baby. News of the Mitchells' divorce occupied the social pages for a few weeks, but the family's unconditional support for Isabella, especially Margaret, turned what could have been a devastating scandal into a story of female empowerment and dignity. In her new home, surrounded by the lush greenery of Greenwich, Isabella began to discover a stronger version of herself. The walls that once witnessed lavish parties now held their moments of reflection and planning for the future. One afternoon, while organizing what would be the baby's room, Isabella found an old photo from her wedding. Looking at the smiling young woman in the white veil, he realized that he no longer felt anger or sadness, only gratitude for the courage to choose a different path. The sun was beginning to set over Greenwich, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. Isabella sat on the porch, her chamomile tea cooling beside her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. Her son stirred in her womb as if agreeing with her decision to build a new beginning for both of them. A week after, moving to Greenwich, Isabella discovered an old box in the mansion's attic. Among yellowed photographs and letters, he found a diary belonging to Robert Mitchell's first wife, who had died 30 years ago. The pages revealed a story eerily similar to hers betrayals, lies, and a woman's struggle to maintain her dignity amid the opulence of the Mitchell family. "You found it too," said Margaret, appearing silently in the attic door. Isabella quickly closed the diary, feeling like an intruder. "No, darling, read on. Caroline would have liked you to know her story." Isabella settled into a dusty armchair while Margaret sat on an antique trunk. "Robert was no different from Richard," the matriarch continued. "Caroline died believing she was the problem. I will not allow history to repeat itself." That same afternoon in Manhattan, Richard faced a mandatory therapy session, a requirement, from the board of Mitchell & Associates for his eventual reinstatement. Dr. Lauren Maxwell watched intently as he described his privileged childhood and estranged relationship with his father. "It was always about appearances," Richard admitted, running his hands over his tired face. "I grew up seeing my father treat relationships like business transactions. When I met Isabella, she was different, authentic, and that scared me." At the Greenwich mansion, Isabella immersed herself in the pages of Caroline's diary. Among the carefully written words he found strength and inspiration. Caroline had planned to leave Robert, but a car accident prevented her from carrying out her plans. Madam, Amanda, the new housekeeper hired by Margaret, interrupted her reading. The decorator arrived to discuss the baby's room. Isabella went downstairs, finding Sofia Rodriguez, a renowned interior decorator, waiting in the hall. "I thought about neutral tones," Sofia began, opening her portfolio. "Something that conveys serenity and a new beginning." As they discussed details of the project, Isabella's phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. "Richard is in hospital. Overdose on medication and alcohol. It's not serious, but I thought you should know." Isabella felt her heart sink, not from romantic love, but from the unfolding human tragedy. Sophia noticed his change in mood. "Everything is fine?" "Yes," Isabella replied, patting her belly. "Just reminders that some people need to hit rock bottom to find redemption." In the private clinic where Richard was admitted, Catherine watched her brother sleep. Margaret arrived silently carrying Caroline's diary. "Maybe it's time for him to know the truth about his stepmother," said the matriarch. Back in Greenwich, Isabella dedicated herself to transforming the mansion. Each renovated room represented a step on her healing journey. The baby's room in soft shades of green and gold became her refuge. James Rothschild, her lawyer, arrived with news about the divorce. "Richard has agreed to all terms," he reported, "including the lifetime pension and trust fund for the baby." "I don't want his money," Isabella protested. "Except—" Margaret, who was attending the meeting, intervened. "Not for you, but for your child. Use it to build something meaningful." The idea germinated in Isabella's mind for the next few days. Between doctor appointments and prenatal yoga sessions, she began developing plans for a foundation, a support space for women in situations similar to hers. Caroline's Hope, she decided to call the project in honor of the woman whose words had given her strength. Margaret, upon hearing the idea, cried for the first time since Isabella had met her. "You are doing what Caroline dreamed of," the matriarch said, holding Isabella's hands. "Turning pain into purpose." At the clinic, Richard read Caroline's diary, finally understanding the cycle of destruction that his family perpetuated. Dr. Maxwell watched her progress with optimistic caution. "I can't change the past," Richard said during one session, "but I can try to be a better father than I was a husband." Isabella received the news of her recovery with serenity. The ultrasound revealed that she was expecting a boy, and she decided to name him Alexander, in honor of her maternal grandfather who always encouraged her to follow her heart. The Caroline's Hope Foundation began to take shape. Catherine, using her contacts in the corporate world, helped structure the project. The Greenwich mansion, so big for just Isabella and the baby, would gain a new wing dedicated to workshops and support groups. "Caroline wrote about dreaming of a place like this," Margaret commented, reviewing the architectural plans. "A refuge where women could reconnect with themselves." Autumn has arrived in Greenwich, painting the trees in shades of red and gold. Isabella, now 7 months pregnant, walked through the mansion's gardens every morning, talking to Alexander about the future they would build together. One afternoon he found an envelope in the mailbox. Inside, a letter from Richard, not begging for reconciliation, but offering a sincere request for forgiveness and a promise to be present in his son's life on the terms Isabella deemed appropriate. Sitting in the office she had transformed into her workspace, Isabella reread the last pages of Caroline's diary. True power lies not in enduring the unbearable, but in choosing your own story. With a serene smile, Isabella began to write her response to Richard, not like a hurt wife, but like a woman who had found her own strength. The autumn sun illuminated his desk, and Alexander moved in his belly as if approving every word his mother wrote. Christmas was approaching in Greenwich, and Isabella was watching the first snowflakes through the window of her office at the newly opened Caroline's Hope Foundation. The once cold and austere walls of the old wing of the mansion now displayed soft colors and inspiring photographs of women who had rebuilt their lives. "The first month's numbers exceeded our expectations," Catherine commented, flipping through a report on her desk. "We have already served 23 women, and the waiting list for the financial empowerment workshops continues to grow." Isabella smiled, stroking her 8-month-old belly. Alexander was particularly active during morning meetings, as if he wanted to participate in important decisions. "Caroline would be proud," she replied, her gaze falling on the portrait of Robert Mitchell's first wife, which held a place of honor on the main wall. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Margaret. "Honey, Richard completed the rehab program today. He's asking to visit the foundation. Isabella felt her heart accelerate. Since their letter, Richard had kept his distance, respecting her space as he worked on his own recovery. "He may come tomorrow," he replied after a reflective pause. "Catherine will be here to present the mentoring program." The next morning, snow was falling gently when Richard arrived at the mansion. He looked different, thinner, with clearer eyes and a sobriety that went beyond substance abuse. He stopped in front of the Caroline's Hope Foundation sign with visible emotion. "Welcome." Isabella greeted him in the entrance hall, Catherine at her side. "Would you like to see our work?" Richard nodded, following them down the hallway decorated with inspirational quotes and artwork created by the program's participants. They stopped in front of a room where a group of women were participating in a group therapy session. "Every story here is unique," Isabella explained, her voice soft but firm. "But they all share a common element, the courage to start over. Like you," Richard commented, his gaze meeting hers briefly. "Isabella, what you've built here is extraordinary." Catherine led them to the meeting room where she presented the foundation's numbers and future projects. Richard listened intently, occasionally taking notes. "I would like to establish a permanent fund," he announced at the end of the presentation, separate from the divorce settlement, to ensure Caroline's Hope can continue to grow. Isabella studied her ex-husband carefully. The arrogant man he had known was giving way to someone more reflective, more aware of the impact of his actions. "Alexander deserves to know this side of his father," she thought. As if reading her thoughts, Richard asked about the baby. Isabella shared the last ultrasound, showing how the little one already had defined features. "He's very active," he commented, "especially during important meetings." "There's already a Mitchell executive in the making," Richard joked, but his smile was gentle without the old arrogance. The afternoon was progressing when Margaret arrived for tea, a tradition she had established with Isabella since moving to Greenwich. He found the three of them chatting civilly in the solarium, discussing plans to expand the foundation's programs to other cities. "Mom," Richard stood up to greet her, "did you know that Caroline's diary would change so many lives?" Margaret poured herself tea, her precise movements masking her emotion. "Caroline always said that our greatest pains can become our greatest mission. Isabella understood that better than any of us." The moment was interrupted by Amanda, the housekeeper, announcing that the first heavy snow of winter was beginning to fall. Richard prepared to leave, but not before handing Isabella an envelope. "These are some thoughts I had during rehab," he explained. "About the kind of father I want to be, the kind of man I'm trying to become. I'm not expecting answers. I just wanted to share." That night, after everyone left, Isabella sat in her favorite armchair in the baby's room, Richard's envelope in her hands. The words he found were unlike anything he had ever written, honest, vulnerable, without attempts at manipulation or self-justification. "Alexander," she whispered, feeling her son's movements. "Your father is learning. And perhaps that is the most important legacy. Caroline left us the understanding that healing is not linear, but worth every step of the way." The snow continued to fall outside, covering Greenwich with a white blanket that seemed to purify the past. In the mansion's library, Caroline's diary rested alongside the first testimonies of the women helped by the foundation, a testimony to how pain can truly transform into purpose. Isabella fell asleep that night with a feeling of peace she hadn't experienced in months. In his dreams, he saw Caroline smiling, and for the first time he completely understood why fate had placed that diary in his path. Some stories need to be told not to keep the pain alive, but to light the path for others who are still lost in the darkness. Alexander's first cry echoed off the walls of Greenwich Hospital on a freezing January morning. Isabella, exhausted but radiant, gazed at her newborn son while Margaret and Catherine took turns photographing each precious moment. The Mitchell's little heir weighed 8 pounds and had the same piercing blue eyes as his mother. "He's perfect," Catherine whispered, adjusting the small wool hat on her nephew's head. And he arrived exactly on the scheduled day like a true executive. In the hallway, Richard waited anxiously, respecting the space that Isabella had established. When he was finally invited in, his hands were visibly shaking as he held his son for the first time. "Hi, Alexander," he murmured, unrestrained tears streaming down his face. "I promise to be better for you." The following days were a whirlwind of adaptations at the Greenwich mansion. The residential wing had been carefully prepared to welcome the new resident, with a monitoring system installed by Catherine and a team of nurses personally selected by Margaret. The Caroline's Hope Foundation continued its activities at the other end of the property now, with a new program focused on single mothers inspired by Isabella's own journey. The women who attended the foundation took turns bringing small gifts to Alexander, turning the baby's arrival into a collective celebration of hope and renewal. "You've created more than a foundation," noted Sofia Rodriguez, who had become a close friend since decorating the baby's room. "It created a community." During the early hours of the morning, while breastfeeding Alexander in her favorite armchair, Isabella reflected on how drastically her life had changed in less than a year. Caroline's diary rested on her bedside table, its pages now familiar, like old friends who had guided her path through her darkest moments. Richard kept his promise to change, showing up punctually at the established times to visit his son, and always respecting the limits imposed by Isabella. His sessions with Dr. Maxwell continued, and he had begun writing a book about his journey of recovery and personal transformation. "The book is not about justifying my mistakes," he explained during one of the visits. "It's about understanding the toxic patterns we perpetuate and how we can break them." The news that Robert Mitchell had decided to retire early as president of Mitchell & Associates surprised Manhattan social circles. Catherine officially took the helm, becoming the first woman to lead the company in its 60-year history. "Times have changed," Robert admitted during a visit to meet his grandson. "And maybe I need to change too." Isabella watched these transformations with a mixture of admiration and caution. Experience had taught him that true change takes time and consistency. Meanwhile, he focused his energy on Alexander and expanding the foundation. A particularly special project began to take shape, a compilation of the stories of the women served by Caroline's Hope, interwoven with excerpts from Caroline's diary. Margaret, upon learning of the initiative, offered access to the Mitchell family's personal archives. "Some stories need to be told," the matriarch said, "so other women know they are not alone." Spring has arrived in Greenwich, bringing with it Alexander's first words and his hesitant steps through the mansion's gardens. Isabella documented every moment, creating a digital diary for her son, a way to ensure he knew his full story when he was older. One afternoon, while Alexander was playing under Catherine's supervision, Isabella found Richard in the foundation's office. He had brought the first chapters of his book for your consideration. "You don't have to read it if you don't want to," he said, placing the manuscript on his desk. "But your opinion matters." Isabella picked up the pages, feeling the weight of the words not just on the paper, but on everything they represented. "I'll read it," she promised, "because it's part of my son's father's story." That night, after putting Alexander to bed, Isabella sat in her study and began to read. Richard's words were raw, honest, and deeply reflective. He didn't try to present himself as a victim, but he also didn't punish himself excessively. It was the story of a man finally facing his shadows. The full moon illuminated the mansion's gardens when Isabella finished reading. In his crib, Alexander slept peacefully, oblivious to the complex paths that had led to his existence. Downstairs, the lights in the foundation wing were still on. An evening support group was underway. Isabella took out her own diary and began to write her impressions of Richard's manuscript. They were not words of forgiveness or romantic reconciliation, but of recognition for the genuine effort at transformation. It was another chapter in the story that they continued to write no longer as a couple, but as parents committed to a better future for their son. Richard's book presentation took place on a golden May afternoon at the Greenwich Public Library. The auditorium was packed with a peculiar mix of people from members of Manhattan's high society to women from the Caroline's Hope Foundation. Isabella occupied a discreet spot in the back with Alexander, now 4 months old, sleeping peacefully on her lap. Broken Patterns. A Journey of Redemption was not just another self-help or confession book. Richard had managed to turn his personal experience into a manifesto on toxic masculinity and the need for change in traditional family dynamics. True power lies not in controlling others. Richard read from the book, his firm voice echoing through the auditorium, but in having the courage to face our own demons. Margaret, sitting in the front row, couldn't hold back her tears. Beside him, Robert Mitchell maintained his usual stoic posture, but his eyes revealed a complex mix of pride and regret. After the presentation, during the autograph session, a young woman approached Isabella. "Your ex-husband wrote this book, but you are the one who inspired the change," she said, identifying herself as Rachel, an early participant in the Foundation's programs. "Your courage gave us all a voice." The Caroline's Hope Foundation had expanded beyond initial expectations. With the Mitchells' financial support and Catherine's efficient management, it already had 3 satellite units in different states. The integrated support model, offering everything from legal assistance to therapy and job placement, was being studied by similar organizations across the country. "We need to talk about the Boston proposal," Catherine commented during a lunch at the mansion a few days after the book's release. "The old mansion on Beacon Street would be perfect for our next expansion." Isabella watched Alexander playing on the living room rug while they discussed the details. The baby already demonstrated a remarkable personality, curious and determined, like his mother with flashes of the Mitchells' natural charisma. "Boston makes sense," Isabella agreed, adjusting the papers spread out on the coffee table. "But I want to keep the focus on the human aspect. We can't become just another impersonal organization." The afternoon was progressing when Richard arrived for his scheduled visit with Alexander. He brought with him an unexpected proposal. He wanted to donate part of the profits from the book to create a men's wing at the Foundation focused on awareness and behavioral change. "Men need to learn to identify and break toxic patterns," he explained while playing with his son. "And who better than Caroline's Hope to lead this conversation?" Isabella studied the proposal carefully. The idea of expanding the Foundation's work to include the male perspective was something she had considered herself, but she wanted to ensure it was done right. "We can start with a pilot project," she suggested. "Discussion groups facilitated by expert therapists, without compromising the safe space we create for women." As they discussed the details, Alexander crawled among them, occasionally stopping to show off his newest toy or let out an infectious laugh. It was impossible not to notice how the dynamic between Isabella and Richard had evolved mutual respect and a focus on their son's well-being, replacing hurt and resentment. The next morning, during a Foundation board meeting, Isabella presented the men's program proposal. Margaret, who chaired the council, was the first to express support. "Caroline always said that true change only happens when everyone is part of the conversation." The matriarch recalled, her voice thick with emotion. "This could be the next important chapter in the Foundation's history." The pilot project was scheduled to begin in 3 months, enough time to develop an appropriate curriculum and train facilitators. Richard volunteered to be an early participant, not as a leader or role model, but as someone still learning and growing. "I don't want Alexander to grow up carrying the same standards that I did," he confided to Isabella during an afternoon in the mansion's garden. "I want him to understand that true strength lies in vulnerability and respect." Isabella watched her ex-husband with a mixture of admiration and caution. The transformation was visible, but she knew that the path to change was long and not always linear. Still, there was something deeply comforting about seeing your son's father genuinely committed to being a better person. Night was falling over Greenwich when Richard said goodbye. Alexander, exhausted after a day of playing, slept peacefully in his crib. Isabella sat at her desk opening her diary, a habit she had inherited from Caroline and maintained as a way of processing her thoughts and emotions. "Perhaps the true happy ending is not about romantic reconciliation," she wrote, "but about finding peace and purpose in the midst of life's transformations." The soft sound of Alexander's breathing filled the room, while outside the foundation's lights remained on a beacon of hope for everyone seeking a new beginning. Isabella smiled, realizing that her story, like Caroline's, would continue to echo through the lives they touched and transformed. A year had passed since that night at Le Bernardin. Caroline's Hope Foundation was celebrating its first anniversary with a benefit in the gardens of the Greenwich mansion. Twinkling lights strung between the ancient trees created a magical atmosphere, as hundreds of guests milled around tables elegantly decorated with white orchids, a silent symbol of Isabella's transformation. Alexander, now 10 months old, sat on Margaret's lap, his blue eyes curiously watching the guests as they approached to greet him. The little Mitchell heir had become the joy of the family, uniting generations in a way no one expected. "He has your smile," Margaret commented to Isabella, who was adjusting Alexander's small suit. "It's the Mitchells' determination, but I hope it inherits their integrity." Isabella observed the crowd gathered in the gardens. Women who had passed through the foundation spoke animatedly with Wall Street executives sharing stories of overcoming and change. The men's program, which began 3 months ago, was already showing promising results, with participants reporting significant transformations in their relationships and life perspectives. Richard arrived discreetly carrying a folder with the latest program reports. His book had become an unexpected bestseller, sparking important discussions about toxic masculinity and destructive family patterns. But more important than commercial success was the visible change in their behavior and attitudes. "The numbers are impressive," he commented, approaching Isabella. "Downtown Boston is ready to open next month." Catherine joined them, holding a glass of champagne. "And Chicago has already shown interest in replicating the model. We need to talk about strategic expansion." The moment was interrupted by Alexander, who decided it was time to demonstrate his latest achievements. Releasing himself from Margaret's lap, he took tentative steps towards Isabella, eliciting gasps from the nearby guests. "Come, my love," Isabella encouraged, bending down to take her son into her arms. The moment perfectly captured the essence of what Caroline's hope represented: strength, a fresh start, and the promise of a better future. Robert Mitchell, who had rarely appeared at public events since leaving the company's presidency, watched the scene with tears in his eyes. In recent months, he had begun his own journey of self-discovery, discreetly attending sessions of the Foundation's men's program. "You've built something extraordinary here," he told Isabella, his voice thick with emotion. "Something that goes far beyond the name Mitchell." The night was advancing when Isabella went up to the small stage set up in the garden. Silence descended on the crowd as she adjusted the microphone, Alexander now sleeping peacefully in Catherine's arms. "A year ago, I found a diary in the attic of this house," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Caroline Mitchell's words showed me that our stories, however painful, can become beacons of hope for others." Isabella continued sharing the Foundation's numbers and success stories, but also talking about the importance of personal transformation and the courage to face difficult truths. Their eyes met Richard's for a moment, and there was a mutual understanding there, not of romantic reconciliation, but of respect for the path each had chosen. "Caroline's hope is not just a foundation," she concluded. "It is a testament that it is possible to transform pain into purpose, fear into strength, and loneliness into community." After the speech, as the guests gave a standing ovation, Margaret approached with a small package. "Caroline would have wanted you to have this," she said, handing Isabella a delicate pearl necklace. "It was hers, passed down through generations of strong women." The jewel glowed softly under the garden lights, carrying with it stories of love loss and rebirth. Isabella put it on, reverently feeling the weight of not just the necklace but the responsibility to continue the legacy of change. Later, when most of the guests had left, Isabella found Richard sitting alone near the playground they had built for Alexander. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she asked, sitting on a nearby swing. "For not giving up on me as a father even, when I deserved it. For showing that transformation is possible even when it seems impossible." Isabella smiled softly. "We all deserve the chance to be better, Richard. What matters is what we do with that chance." The sound of children's laughter reached them. Alexander had woken up and was playing with Catherine near the fountain. The little one was already showing signs of the Mitchells' keen intelligence combined with the compassion that Isabella worked so hard to cultivate in him. "He will grow up knowing a different version of strength," Isabella mused, "one that comes from vulnerability, honesty, and respect." The night was clear, with stars shining brightly over Greenwich. At the mansion, the lights in the foundation wing remained on. A nightly support group was underway, soft voices sharing stories of hope and healing. Isabella took in her home no longer a symbol of imprisonment in an unhappy marriage, but a beacon of transformation and possibility. Caroline's diary rested in her office, its pages now supplemented by hundreds of other stories of women who found their voice and their worth. "What happens now?" Richard asked, breaking the contemplative silence. "We continue," Isabella replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first lights of dawn were beginning to appear. "We continue to grow, learn, transform. That's what we do, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary." Alexander ran towards them, his steps steadier every day, bringing with him the promise of a future where the stories of Caroline Isabella and so many other women would continue to inspire change. One heart at a time,